Welcome. Today we're heading into, well, a truly vast and ancient place, the Egyptian Sahara. It's so much more than just endless sand, isn't it? It's this landscape shaped by um, incredible natural forces and, well, deep, deep history.
Absolutely. And that's what we want to explore today, looking at the physical reality, the geography, the geology,
Yeah.
the actual landscape. We'll use the material we have to sort of pull out the key details for you, bring it to life.
Okay, great. So let's start with just the sheer size. How big are we really talking about here?
We are talking immense. The Sahara Desert itself overall is about 9.2 million square kilometers.
Wow.
And Egypt's entire western border just runs right along this huge expanse.
It's almost impossible to get your head around. But is it that classic image, just flat sand forever?
No, not at all. And that's, I think, one of the first really striking things. The Egyptian Sahara is incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
Yes, you absolutely get towering sand dunes,
Right.
famously in the Great Sand Sea. Some of those can reach over 250 meters high.
250 meters.
Mhm.
That's taller than skyscrapers. Just sand. How?
Well, it tells you something about the sheer amount of sand available and the power and consistency of the wind over just immense periods of time.
Okay.
But you also find really dramatic rock formations, things like Gebel Uwainet, way down south, or the really unique shapes you see in the White Desert,
Ah, yes.
sculpted by the wind. And then scattered across this landscape are these vital oases like Siwa Oasis, Baharia Oasis.
Bread savers, basically.
Totally. Critical water sources supporting these, little islands of unique ecosystems. And then you even have salt flats.
Salt flats, like dried up lakes.
Exactly. They're remnants of ancient lakes that evaporated, leaving behind these like glistening crusts of salt. You find them around the Karga Oasis, for example.
It's a real mix. Dunes, rocks, oases, these
Yeah.
ghost lakes of salt, a much richer picture.
Definitely.
Now, what about underneath all that? What does the geology tell us? What's the deep history?
The geology is fascinatingly complex. It really tells a story stretching back millions and millions of years. It's been shaped by huge tectonic forces
Right.
and the slow, steady layering of sediments over time.
Right.
The whole region sits on top of these significant underground structures called basins. You can think of them as like vast depressions in the Earth's crust.
Right.
And over eons, they've just collected layers upon layers of rock and sediment. The material mentions several important ones: the Sirte Basin, the Western Desert Basin, the Suez Graben, and the Nile Delta area.
And these basins, they hold different types of rock layers.
Exactly. Different layers formed at different times holding different things. You get porous rocks, sandstones, quartzites, marine carbonates. These act as reservoir rods.
Places where fluids can collect, like water or...
Precisely. Water or, very significantly for the region, oil and gas. And these layers formed over huge geological timescales. Cambrian Ordovician, that's really ancient pre-dinosaur stuff.
Yeah.
Then the Cretaceous, the age of dinosaurs, and right up through more recent periods like the Paleocene, Eocene, Miocene.
Okay. And then you have what are called source rocks, often shales, marine shales from the late Cretaceous up through the Oligocene, or even older Silurian black shales. These are the layers where organic material got buried and essentially cooked underground over time, generating hydrocarbons.
Got it. So some layers make the oil and gas, other layers trap it. And what created the traps? What forces were at play?
Really powerful tectonic activity. The material points to things like Horst and Graben block faulting.
Horst and Graben.
Yeah, imagine the Earth's crust cracking and shifting. Some blocks get pushed up, those are the Horsts, and others drop down, those are the Grabens. It creates this sort of stepped landscape underground.
Okay, I can picture that.
And there are also large-scale folds in the rock layers, big wrinkles essentially, including systems like the Syrian Arc that runs across northern Egypt, plus all the faulting associated with the creation of the Nile Valley itself and the Suez and Red Sea, Grabens, those massive rifts.
They all played a huge role in shaping the subsurface, and the presence of things like Triassic clastic rocks and really thick salt layers in places like northern Egypt and Sinai. Salt acts like a fantastic seal.
Ah, like a lid.
Exactly. It forms an impermeable cap, trapping resources in the reservoir rocks below.
So it becomes clear how that deep geological past, those structures, directly influence what we find today. These folds or anticlines and the faulted blocks. That's where oil and gas get trapped, as the material points out.
Precisely. It's a direct result of those ancient geological processes and the way the layers built up.
Okay, let's shift forward in time a bit, though still way back.
Yeah.
How did this landscape change more recently, say, during the Holocene epoch?
This is where the story gets really intertwined with human history. And one of the most powerful points is that this super dry desert we see now.
Hmm.
It wasn't always like this.
Really? It was wetter.
Much wetter. During the early Holocene, thousands of years ago, the Sahara supported savanna, grasslands, lakes. It was a very different environment. But then, over time, it went through this profound drying out,
A massive climate shift.
a huge environmental transformation. And this shift towards the hyperarid conditions we generally see today, that was largely complete by around, say, 1500 BC.
1500 BC. That feels surprisingly recent for such a dramatic change. How did people cope? How did it affect them?
Well, this drying trend was a massive driver for human movement and cultural change. The early inhabitants were adapted to that wetter world. You had Mesolithic fisher-hunter-gatherers along the Nile, and out in the wider plains, more mobile groups, herders, fishers, foragers, moving between seasonal camps.
Makes sense for a greener Sahara.
But as the landscape got drier and drier, it naturally pushed people towards the reliable water sources.
The Nile, the oases.
Exactly,
And,
concentrating populations there. The material notes the evidence for more permanent, settled life and focused farming things like durable buildings, and the remains of domesticated cereals like emmer wheat and barley that shows up later in the Nile Valley. For instance, in burials at places like Mostigeta from the early 4th millennium BC.
So the environmental pressure kind of pushed towards agriculture and settlement along the river.
It seems that way. It was an adaptation. And there's some really fascinating evidence from burial sites dating back to the mid-5th millennium BC, out in the Sahara at Gebel Ramla.
What do they find there?
The burials show strong cultural connections between the Nile Valley people and the Sahara people at that time. They seem to have shared a common ritual approach to burial across that whole vast region.
Wow. Shared rituals across such a distance, even before large settlements, suggests a pretty connected world back then.
It really does. And the material also mentions something quite intriguing, the emergence of what some researchers call a cattle cult around 4000 BC.
A cattle cult.
Yeah, particularly in places like Nabta Playa and areas in the Central Sahara. The evidence includes ritual burials of cattle.
Burying cattle ritually. Why?
Well, one idea is that it might have been a kind of social response to the increasing dryness and droughts. Maybe using precious livestock in these rituals was a way for communities to try and cope with the environmental stress, the unpredictability.
Trying to find some control or meaning in a changing world through ritual. That's powerful.
And you see another interesting shift around 3000 BC. These stone mounds, tumuli, that were apparently first used for burying cattle, they started being used as human tombs.
So the symbolism changed.
Right. Their function shifted as societies evolved alongside the environmental pressures. By the late Predinastic period back in the Nile Valley, you see agriculture really intensifying. People developed strategies like modifying the flood basins, digging irrigation channels.
Adapting again.
Adapting to deal with the Nile floods, becoming perhaps less predictable, needing more management.
It's really striking how the physical environment, the drying climate, the river's behavior, directly shaped not just how people live, but their social structures, maybe even their beliefs and rituals. And how do we piece together these links between the ancient landscape and the human story? The material mentions geoarchaeology.
Yes, it's such a crucial field for this. It bridges geology and archaeology. And a key early figure mentioned is Eleanor Wright Gardner. She was actually one of the first university-trained geologists to really specialize in this kind of interdisciplinary work in Egypt.
Working with archaeologists.
Yeah, she collaborated closely with archaeologists like Gertrude Caton Thompson. Her focus was on understanding the ancient landscapes and how they related to where people lived and the resources they used.
So looking at the landforms, the rocks, to figure out the human past.
Exactly. For example, her studies in places like the Fayum Depression and the Karga Oasis involved investigating things called paleo-spring tufas.
Paleo-spring tufas, what are those?
They're basically mineral deposits left behind by ancient springs that don't flow anymore. Finding and studying these deposits, like she did in Upper Wadi El Rafuf, tells you where water was available thousands of years ago.
Ah, so where people might have gathered or settled.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic way geology can unlock clues about human history and past environments.
That really drives home how understanding the ground itself is key to understanding the human stories that played out on it. Okay, bringing it to the present day.
Yeah.
How does anything survive out there now with so little rain?
Life is tenacious, but yeah, it's incredibly tough. Water is the absolute limiting factor. The desert environment, though, has ways of managing the little rainfall it gets.
How so?
Well, when rain does fall, often in these intense, localized storms, the runoff from large areas gets funneled through wadis, those dry riverbeds you see everywhere,
Right.
and it collects in low-lying depressions, sometimes called dayas, water pools there temporarily. And then you also have the chats or sebkas, those salt flats we talked about. They're endorheic basins.
Meaning the water doesn't drain out to the sea?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Water flows in, collects, and then mostly evaporates, leaving the salts behind. But for a time, they hold water.
So the landscape itself sort of concentrates the water.
In a way, yes, through these features. And even in rocky, mountainous areas, shallow soils and moisture trapped deep in rock cracks can support some vegetation. Perennial plants out there have developed amazing root systems.
That's adaptable.
Incredibly flexible. They can go really deep to find water in fissures or spread out wide and shallow just under the surface to catch any bit of moisture. But ultimately, plant growth is just completely dictated by water availability.
When and where it rains.
Exactly. The timing of rainfall, how much falls even from just one isolated storm, that's what triggers a growing season, however brief it might be.
It sounds like a really delicate, opportunistic kind of existence for plants.
It absolutely is. It highlights the incredible resilience required, the very specific adaptations needed to survive in such an extreme place.
Wow. This whole discussion really paints a picture of the Egyptian Sahara that's, well, it's so much more dynamic and complex than just a big desert.
It really is. The material shows us this landscape sculpted over truly deep time by massive geological forces, uplift, faulting, sedimentation, and then reshaped again by these dramatic climate shifts over thousands of years.
We've touched on the sheer scale, but also the incredible variety within it, those massive dunes, the ancient rock formations, the vital oases, the salty remnants of old lakes.
And the complex geology hidden beneath the surface, a result of forces that, also happen to determine where valuable resources might be found today.
And crucially, how those profound environmental changes in the past didn't just alter the land, but fundamentally drove human history there, pushing migrations, forcing adaptations, shaping cultures.
Yeah, from the earliest mobile groups having to respond to the drying conditions, to the later intensification of farming along the Nile to cope with river changes, even seeing shifts in ritual practices like those cattle burials changing to human ones. The human story is just completely woven into the physical history of the Sahara.
It really makes you look at any landscape, even one that seems empty or static, completely differently, doesn't it?
It does.
Thinking about the immense timescales, the powerful forces involved, and then the layers upon layers of human experience etched into the very stones and sands, it definitely leaves you wondering, what other stories are still buried out there, waiting to be read in the Egyptian Sahara?